I'll start off with a presentation on Amplify MedTech, and then we'll get into the conversation with Elyse. I'm very excited to have Elyse on board today to talk to us about product market fit. Amplify MedTech is a relatively new venture. I launched Amplify MedTech in November of 2024. So in a couple months, we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary. But basically, I am Fehmida Kapadia. I'm the founder of Amplify MedTech. I have a background in medical devices. I've been working with MedTech startups for almost 20 years. And I noticed a gap in the region around support and resources that are very specifically tailored to MedTech companies. And that was my purpose for starting Amplify MedTech. So our mission basically is to create a collaborative MedTech ecosystem so that we can have more collaboration, sharing of resources, which creates an environment for startups to build and grow and be successful. The easier it is for companies to get access to resources, the faster they are growing. We work with everybody in the ecosystem because we believe that everyone is required. Startups need service providers need startups. Our goal is to create a vibrant, sustainable, and locally engaged ecosystem so that we can stimulate the economic growth of the area as well. So in the last 9 months, we've been supporting educational events, workshops, and networking. We do in-person events. We do online events that are ongoing on a monthly basis. We also do in-person networking events so that people get a chance to meet and connect with each other in person. Our next networking event will be in November when we'll celebrate our 1-year anniversary. As I mentioned, we work with everybody in the ecosystem. That's from startups to service providers to entrepreneurial service organizations, economic development agencies, governments, academic institutions, again, because an interplay of all these players is essential for success. Startups need to not only collaborate with investors and service providers, but they also need to be able to collaborate with hospitals and academic institutions in order to move their product development forward. And so keeping that in mind, we collaborate with everyone in the ecosystem. I want to let you know that our next online event is going to be on de-risking MedTech product development. So we'll have a design firm and a CEO of a MedTech product company who will be joining us. The QR code for the event is up there, so we would love for you to join us. And we would love for you to follow us on LinkedIn as well so that you can keep up with everything that's going on with Amplify MedTech, and you can join us as and when it works for you. So with that, I am extremely excited to welcome Elyse Hoeb today for our conversation on product market fit for MedTech devices. Elyse, I would love to turn it over to you so that you can introduce yourself to us.
Hi, everybody. I am thrilled to be here today. My name is Elyse Hoeb. I run a small consulting firm, Elyse Hoeb Consulting, and I work all across different types of startups. I help medical device, digital health, and diagnostic companies, either as a strategic advisor or fractional COO. So my background, I've been in healthcare my whole career, started off at CDC. I've had 2 successful startups. The first was corporate wellness that got acquired in 2016. And then most recently, I was a co-founder and chief operating officer of Clear Masks, transparent surgical masks. We scaled that 0 to 45 million with no outside investment, and we distributed 19 million masks during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was really proud of our work in improving health equity by improving communication during such a challenging time. So thrilled to be here. I work with many different startups, like I said, about product market fit and getting them on the market. We all know healthcare and biotech is a tricky space. So excited to provide some examples today of all the different work I do.
Thank you, Elyse. So let's kick this off. What is product market fit? We hear this term quite a bit, right? So let's distill it down a little bit. Let's talk about what is product market fit.
Yeah, so I think in terms, if we look at like the healthcare landscape, it gets so much more complicated than really any other industry. So we're all in the most complicated industry for product market fit. It's not just about the buyer. The buyer can be lots of different people. So typically I think about what are the providers, so clinicians, like what is the value proposition for them? We think about payers or insurance. What is the value proposition for them? And then also, what is the value proposition for the patient? And then a new one that I like to think about is the purchaser. So what is the value proposition for the person who is making that purchasing decision? Is it the head clinician? Is it somebody in a purchasing department for a large hospital system? Because you need to provide value to them too, make it an easy purchasing process and make it easy for them to implement your product at their institution. So I'll give you an example of like how all this fits together. To me, I always think about it like a puzzle. One of my clients has created a very important device. It's a smaller product for the ICU space. So in critical care, there are lots of cords. It's a known issue. You can have up to 20 cords per patient attached to them. They get all tangled up. It can be a huge safety risk. There's many incidences of patients falling, hitting their head, even dying because of the cords. Not to mention for the nurses, it takes so much time. So if we're thinking about product market fit for that type of product, so let's go through everybody. Payers, insurance. Luckily for them, it's a supply, not a regulated medical device. And so fantastic. We don't work with payers. We don't go through insurance. Normally that's a huge value proposition that we don't need to work with. Providers. So in this case, we found it was typically the nurses. They're the ones who are working one-on-one with the patient. They're the ones making sure the patient can get up, walk around, which we know through evidence leads to faster recovery times. They're the ones dealing with the cords. And so that's typically your user. If we think about the patient, they're a beneficiary of having their cords organized. They benefit from a more sustained system and a more streamlined system. But they're in the ICU. They're not really like thinking about their cords. They're just trying to get better as much as possible. So who's that champion? That's going to be your nurse. And then thinking about purchasing, what kind of influence do they have in the hospital system? So the most tragic thing I think in MedTech is creating something that absolutely helps, absolutely saves time and money, but there's not that full value proposition in terms of getting it adopted. Because it's what I've learned is it's a political game a lot of times in hospital systems. Who has the influence to make that purchasing decision and who has that influence to get to supply chain, get to a value analysis committee and turn that over so that they can actually make that purchasing decision. Sometimes it's nurses, but a lot of times it's not. And so for this particular device, we were thinking about, okay, how can you empower nurses to translate their stories that they know to be true? I'm spending up to 20 minutes per shift, untangling cords, patients are falling on them, the lines are pulling out, major safety issues. But how do you translate that into something that they can advocate for, either for a value analysis committee or a purchasing? So one of the techniques that I think can be really helpful is creating a advocacy document, basically to have the person who's the champion for the product, in this case, it's the nurses, and give them everything they need to convince other people that this is something that we need. And so
Sorry. That was weird.
Moving on. Yeah. And so for this type of client, it's really interesting to think about how do we fit all these puzzle pieces together, and how do we get the person who's actually impacted by the product to make it through purchasing and make that decision convincing to the hospital system.
Right. So at least you touched on the most important point. Who's the user? Who's the influencer? And who's the purchaser? And oftentimes, if we don't understand that, we mistake the user for the purchaser. I've seen so many instances where that happens, where it's like, oh, I know that this person is going to use it, so they're going to be the purchaser as well. So I'll give you an example. I was working with a very early stage product that had developed an AI based platform for doing product design, right? And product design, often when a medtech company is working on product design, they have to go back and forth multiple times with the product design firm, making sure that all the criteria are met, that the design is appropriate, it meets UI UX criteria, all of those things. And it can take from months to years, depending upon how complicated the product is, to finalize that product design. So this company was like, well, we'll develop an AI-based product design platform that will cut down this time significantly. And when I first started talking to them, they said, oh, well, we are going to sell this to the people who are going to be who are going to do the product design, which means that we are going to market this to the startups and the researchers. And they will buy our platform and they will do their product design, and then they will just give that product design to the design firm to execute. And we had to go back and forth on that, because if you develop a design and you give it to the design firm still has to validate that design. They still have to make sure that everything is okay before they're willing to move forward with that project. So in that case, the user is the startups and the researchers and the inventors who are going to work with the design firm to design the product, but actually they are not the buyers, because without the design firm's buy-in, that platform does not create value for anyone. Because if the design firm insists on still validating everything manually, then you have to go back to the drawing board, right? And so that switch had to happen, where they had to realize that the payer is the design firm, the user is their client, and not the other way around, right? And sometimes, and in some instances, they might themselves, the design firm, their engineers might themselves use the product as well. But that switch was so important in them actually understanding what their business model is, right? Because if they were to go out and try and market this to inventors or to startups, they would not have gotten any traction around this, and they would have been spinning their wheels trying to make progress on that product. And so understanding that who's the user, who's the influencer, and who's the purchaser. Now, Elyse, you gave an example about hospital systems. GPOs are notoriously complicated for getting products in, right? And it takes, as you mentioned very clearly, it is a political game. You need an influencer, you need a doctor in the healthcare system, or a very influential nurse or administrator in the healthcare system, who is actually going to put your product in front of the GPO. Not saying you cannot go to the GPO directly on your own, but then you will have to prove your value prop to them. It will take much longer. And if they're not convinced, they may not agree to add you to the list. So that having that internal champion basically becomes your influencer, right? That doctor or administrator or nurse who was going to say, hey, we are very interested in using this product. We want this on our inventory, is the influencer who is going to influence the GPO's buying decisions. So, having said that, I mean, when we talk about GPOs, right? Like a hospital is going to have multiple products on their shelf, which means that there is a lot of competition. How do you manage competition, and how does competition align with product market fit? When a company is developing a product, how should they think about competition in their product market fit matrix?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like the idea of you before you launch your product, everything's already figured out. So there's no surprises once you do that launch. There's always going to be surprises, but it's minimized as much as possible. So with that, you absolutely need to know your competition, because you need to know, once you've identified your user, like we talked about, who's the person searching for this type of product, who has the need. What are they going to be searching for? What is their specific need that's come up during customer discovery? Or how do they use, in their own words or in their industry jargon, how would they describe the need for this product? So a really good example that was unfortunately really hard for the startup that I was working with to see and hear, but good to understand. So I was working with a biofeedback pelvic floor medical device that had a huge breakthrough. What the breakthrough was is essentially now you can do pelvic floor physical therapy that's clinical grade, the same quality you would get in person from home. And the reason that's really important is because the huge target is new mothers. The
Mhm.
weeks after giving birth, pelvic floor physical therapy can be hugely beneficial to them. And if you're a new mom and you're with your baby all the time, the likelihood of you being able to leave, get that childcare covered, and go into pelvic floor physical therapy and prioritize that, it just doesn't happen with new moms. So being able to do it from home, telehealth, huge. We thought this would be an enormous opportunity. So what we found was the person searching in this case is the patient. They're seeking out the care. And what we found is what they're looking for are Kegel exercises, which is fantastic. That's something that's really beneficial. But they don't understand what pelvic floor physical therapy is. They don't understand how important it is and what the difference is between all these different Kegel exercises devices on the market and working with a pelvic floor physical therapist. Plus, looking at it from their lens, they are looking at cost. Unfortunately, as in many things in women's health, pelvic floor physical therapy is not covered well by insurance. And so they're thinking, okay, I'm going to have to make an out-of-pocket decision. Do I want to pay for a one-time device? Or do I want to pay for this ongoing care that I need to go to every week, plus this biofeedback device? And for them, understanding that difference was so hard to communicate. When looking at the different products from their perspective, it looked like everything was a scientific product. It looked like everything was validated. And so understanding what was actually an FDA cleared product versus something that was just an over-the-counter product, it looked like everything was going to have the efficacy that they wanted and get the results that they wanted. And so we found the space is too crowded. Trying to go in and market directly to the patients, it's too difficult because it's too hard for them to understand what is something that they're going to pay for at one time, pay $300, $400, and then put it in a drawer, versus do this ongoing care. And so it was really disappointing to see that. We found that even though it was much better, the communication piece was too hard. And then marketing to pelvic floor physical therapists, there's just not that general understanding of what pelvic floor physical therapy is and needing to seek it out. In some communities, especially high-income communities, there was that awareness, but generally across women, especially new mothers, it just didn't exist.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, do you think doulas might have been a good target market for this device?
I think they would have been a great target market for this, because they're engaged. There's somebody who already is interested. They're already engaging the patient, and then they can make that official recommendation because they do have that, clinical parallel credential. So I think that could have been a really interesting approach, and you could have gotten people because they have that trust and they believe that provider. But for widespread adoption, it was just such an uphill battle, which was disappointing.
Yeah, yeah, I understand that completely. And so that is like identifying again your right customer segment. Who is going to buy that product is so very critical. This also like you identified like the most important competition that most companies face, which is the status quo. Kegel exercises are the status quo. They are free, they are something that people are used to. And even if they may not be as effective, that cost of switching that we talk about, if it is not convincing enough, it is very hard to get someone to buy that product, right? So I'll give you an example. Like I've been working with a company that is developing a wearable for cardiac monitoring. And when she pitches, she's it's earlier stage, and so oftentimes when she pitches it as, oh, we're developing a cardiac monitoring wearable device, and the pushback that she gets is, my Apple Watch can do that. I don't need this, right? And the thing is, it's all in the messaging. Like arrhythmia monitoring is a very complicated space. And doctors need to monitor arrhythmias. Doctors need to monitor arrhythmias when they are dosing patients on medication. And right now, the way they do it is that they have patients in the hospital while they're dosing them because it's not safe to send them home because they have to constantly monitor if their heartbeat is really abnormal, then they have to adjust the dosing. But if there was a device that could allow them to send the patient home and be very confident that the monitoring is going to alert them and keep up with their patient's health, that would change the paradigm. And if that is the positioning, then no one is going to tell you my Apple Watch can do that because your Apple Watch cannot do that, right? So, really understanding that. And then there are other devices on the market as well. Like iRhythm has a two-lead monitoring device that pretty much goes right over your heart right here, and it's for monitoring cardiac arrhythmias. Problem is, when you hear from doctors, it's like, well, it's only two leads. It doesn't give me enough information, right? I want the eight leads to get all the information that I need. So, all of these things, like you have to be so intentional about developing your competitor matrix, really researching the space that you are in, and understanding what is already available in the market and how am I different? And if you cannot articulate how am I different and what value will I create, it's very, very hard to get the buy in that you need from your customers because that's what they'll tell you. I already have my Apple Watch. Oh, iRhythm has a really cool device that is so tiny, I can just use that. And you have to be able to present your case and say, yes, I acknowledge these are my competitors, and this is how we are better, which can make a case for convincing them why they should be buying your device over what is already existing in the market. And that brings me to unmet need. The competition, what exists in the market, right, is what is already available. So, where is the need? There is always going to be something available in the market that people are using. They may not be buying it. When I say something available in the market, not every product, not every solution is something people are buying. So, for example, in the example that Elyse gave, Kegel exercises are not something that you're buying, right? It is the status quo, it's what people are doing. So, how do you differentiate for how people are already managing that condition to defining what is the need?
Yeah, so it's been so amazing to watch the growth of women's health and watch that there's more research going into it, more devices, more funding. It's been a joy. A lot of my clients have been in women's health, and it's been wonderful to be an advocate in that way. One that really opened up my eyes, I was just educated on it, was the area of vulvar health. It's essentially not included in the medical school curriculum. Many times, nursing, PA, it's just a void. One of my clients is a sexual medicine expert, and she is an expert in vulvar health. And so she is the expert that's the guest physician that'll go to these different hospitals and educate their physicians on it. A lot of times she will ask a question, what can you name a couple of the basic pieces of anatomy for the vulva? People can't answer. And she actually released a study recently that shows that physicians in general don't feel comfortable treating it. Patients don't even know that it's an issue. So huge unmet need. And it's really interesting. I feel like this represents a lot of what's going on in women's health, where it's an unknown unknown. Women know, they know they're having the symptoms. A lot of times they go to a provider, they get an incorrect diagnosis, and they have to go chase that diagnosis over a course of up to 10 years. For vulvar health, it's usually 7 to 10 years, multiple physicians getting an incorrect diagnosis, especially for UTIs, over and over again. So she developed a differential diagnosis app, and it has two ends, thinking about, who is your user. There's two different products with different UX, UI, but the same type of underlying AI technology. For individual patients, it's, okay, I live in an area where I can't necessarily access this vulvar expert. What can I get that's the next best thing? And using AI to be able to put in my symptoms and get some information, at least get started and get some education about my body and myself. The other side of it is physicians just don't have that knowledge. They were also not being served by the system. And so catching them up by being able on the physician side, put in the symptoms of the patient, get a differential diagnosis, get the ideally like what the different options could be. And then we still need a clinician to review it and then decide what the treatment plan is down the road. So unmet need, but people don't even know that it's a problem because they're going to providers and not being treated as a vulvar health condition. It's being seen as lots of different other things. And it provides another example in women's health where historically, basically, if you're not a white man, we know this, you're not included in clinical research in the past. And so these aren't documented, and there's no evidence of these different issues. It's women sharing their stories, or all sorts of different populations sharing their stories, getting gaslit by providers. A lot of times the providers, they weren't trained either. So it's a system that serves nobody, but it's really hard for women's health startups to get that clinical evidence they need and get those statistics to show in their deck and get investment to say, okay, this is an issue. This is the number of people that it serves. We are catching up. There's been a push to have more research in women's health. We're getting more data, more reports are being released. And so things are getting better, but it's a long line to catch up over the past 100 years, 1,000 years, where the research just wasn't done. And so it's a really interesting space. I'm excited to see the catch up. It's a huge space. You have a target population of 50% of the population, and it's a great space to invest in. But I want to watch it, and I'm really excited about the different solutions that will come up and the research that'll back it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Like femtech is really a growing space. And it's funny that we're like, oh, femtech is a growing space. Well, it's a growing space because we haven't done anything about femtech so far. I mean, I have had a similar experience with women who are going through menopause. There was nothing available to support women that are going through menopause or in menopause. It was stunning to me that a, a physician who is trained as an OBGYN has zero menopause curriculum in their studies, right? So when a woman who's going through menopause goes to their PCP or their OBGYN, the advice that they get is not optimum. And that resulted in, like, we started recognizing this. And it was only like 5 years ago that people started speaking about this openly, right? Like, period and menopause are bad words that we are not supposed to say, even though they are a part of biology. So, even though women were experiencing this on a regular basis, they didn't feel comfortable actually telling everybody how they're feeling or what their body is going through and how they're struggling. And so, as more conversations have come about, now I know that there are a couple of platforms that actually, they're telehealth platforms that provide menopause health support. They have no clinicians and nurses who are trained as menopause specialists who are working with women and providing support. And again, that identifying that there was, I mean, the competition in that space when these platforms was launched was OBGYNs, which really was not a competition because they weren't addressing any of the issues, right? So identifying, they were so good at identifying this blue ocean space, literally, when nothing was being done to serve this population. 50% of the population, a third of our lives are spent in menopause. So that's a pretty large market space, if you're asking me, right? And so they were wonderful about identifying this blue ocean and creating this product. But then that brings me to, when you are going into a blue ocean space, how do you get reimbursed? How do you get paid when our entire healthcare system is dependent on reimbursement from insurance, and insurance goes by what is already existing? We have ICD-9 codes and existing HCPCS codes and DRG codes, and that becomes how we get reimbursed. So how do we think about reimbursement when we are launching a disruptive product?
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting space because it is associated with health equity. Because, like you said, that's how we access healthcare in the US largely is by insurance if we're lucky enough to have health insurance. And so it brings up interesting ways of introducing things into the market because you need so much evidence and so much real world evidence to show it's been in the market, it is effective. But then how do you get it into the market if people can't access it, if they can't pay for it? So I think about it in different types of, like, almost like a tier. And the more access that people have, the more that it's subsidized essentially by somebody else, the greater population that you can reach. So a lot of times I do see startups entering with out-of-pocket payment. And unfortunately, that only targets like a very small amount of people, either very desperate or have the financial means to access it. And it's not necessarily their fault because they do need to collect that evidence before launching it to a larger population. But that could be a good way to get started. It is less health equity, but you're on the market, people pay out of pocket.
Mhm.
Then I think about like more access. You can at least get an FSA, flexible spending account, or HSA, health spending account. That's offered through certain employers. A lot of times if there's like a high deductible plan, and then the employer will partially fund it, or you can fund it through pre-tax money. So essentially your healthcare expenses are covered or eliminated from tax. So that's a way that you can access more of the population, but usually it's more high income people who have access to an HSA account. Typically they're part of like an employer system. And so you're not going to reach as many like vulnerable folks or folks that are, relying on part-time payment. Then if we can get insurance reimbursement, that's huge. That opens up so many different people. That's amazing. And then within that, there's commercial health insurance, and then CMS, so Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. You can access the Medicare population, incredible. Huge population, hats off to you. But even more important is the Medicaid population, which is usually need-based. In an ideal system, that would be all low-income people in the United States would be on Medicaid. Unfortunately, the political situation, that's not always the case. But that, I think, once you've reached that, you've reached a large portion of the population. If we expand on top of that, man, how nice would it be if the service was just covered through government subsidies and you can either access it or get some sort of, coverage like we had during COVID? How nice would that be? We'll see if it actually happens. But that would be ultimate health equity and access.
Right. So, I mean, for startups that are developing, right, our goal is to get reimbursement through CMS. We get the code that is required. And oftentimes we'll tap into existing codes to get to market early. And then, see if we need to get a new code, we might go in for a follow-on code after that. But it's also like think about how you can go to market using alternative forms of reimbursement. So, um, can your product serve a different market altogether? For example, if you have a product that requires a reimbursement code, do you also have a direct to customer model that you can exploit early on, right? And that way you can start getting paid. Or, as Elyse likes to say, is there a market in the vet space, in the veterinary space that we can go to first before we get into the human market? I would also I've also seen instances where people have gone into the workers' comp market where relevant, right? Because you don't need a CMS code to go be be in the workers' comp. Yeah, you need your regulatory approvals. You definitely need to go through your FDA, but you don't need a CMS code because workers' comp is paid by the company. And so you can go to market through workers' comp. Similarly, DoD and VA are other great markets because you don't need a CMS code to go into DoD or VA markets because they have their own pot of money and they're going to make an outright purchase. So think about exploring alternative ways to get to market while you're trying to, in case you need a new code, right? If you have an existing code that you can tap into, wonderful. But in case you need a new code, think about alternative ways to get to market early, generate the data, because in order for you to get a new code, they ask for data. They ask for relevance, right, to issue you a new code. And so you have to have a different way of going to market in order to be able to generate that data. So we've talked about a lot of different things, and Elyse, I know we can talk about a few more things as well, but we've we've covered 80% of product market fit in this conversation. I know that there are other things like product development or business model that we can talk further on, but I want to open it up to questions because I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions that you want to discuss. So I want to open it up to questions so that we can, address your respective questions.
While we're waiting for questions, I'm just going to add a little bit to
Mm-hmm.
piece, and then let's I would love to hear what you all have to say. But I think sometimes there's some misconceptions with insurance reimbursement that like, oh, if there's efficacy of the product, then you will automatically get insurance reimbursement. That's not always the case. So for insurance reimbursement, you're saving the insurance company money. That's how you get reimbursement. And what that means is a lot of times you're preventing a more expensive chronic complication down the line. So that's why cardiac can be so attractive in that space, or preventing diabetes. Oh my gosh, if you can prevent diabetes, that is a lot of spending from the insurance company. And so when thinking about insurance reimbursement, less about like, the efficacy, although that is, you have to have the efficacy as a baseline, but how are you going to prevent further spending down the way? So just clarifying that. And then, yeah, let's take questions. I'd love to hear what you all have to say.
Absolutely. Norel says just because CMS has a code does not mean insurance will. Do you have a comment to that, Elyse?
Let's see. Yeah, just because you qualify for a code doesn't mean that they're going to go ahead and say that, yes, this prevents a future condition, or this is going to save us money down the line. So I agree with that. Even though there's things that have efficacy, if it's not saving them money down the line, that's how you need to think about it with reimbursement. So we talked about, like, what is the value proposition for payers? Insurance, what is the value proposition for providers, clinicians? What is the value proposition for the patient? They may or may not be the user. And then what is the value proposition for the purchaser? They all need distinct value propositions, and insurance is its own game.
Yeah. Just to add a real world example to that, in my previous role, there was, a diagnostic with CMS codes. Typically, the insurance companies are supposed to reimburse something that does have CMS coding for that population. And so United and Blue Cross Blue Shield did, but Aetna didn't. They listed it as experimental. Yeah, you're not going to fight that.
Yeah,
Well,
that's a really good point. It's especially when you're a startup, you're usually going up against institutions. It's really hard to go up against institutions.
yeah, but the point is, if they listed it as experimental, I'm hoping that in a couple of years they would take it off once there was enough data available to start covering it.
Yeah, it's the kiss of death. You can appeal it, but you're not going to get reimbursed unless you fill out their, what they require on a dossier to get onto their insurance plan.
Right, right. Absolutely. It is a challenging space, and it is something that we have to navigate, which is why we have to be aware of what are the other models that we can use to go to market, right? Like, so while we're waiting for some questions, I also wanted to touch on business models, right? Because you can also think about how you can start becoming revenue positive, and what are the best ways to becoming revenue positive. So there are different ways we can go to market, right? Like, Elyse, do you want to maybe touch on some business models that you have been familiar with that have worked well?
So even with that pelvic floor device that I was talking about, there were multiple business models within that one device. And so there was pelvic floor physical therapy that we were hypothesizing that we were going to offer in parallel to the device. So the pelvic floor physical therapy was a subscription model. And then the device, it's interesting with devices, you can think about it as like single use or, single patient use. You buy it outright and then you own it, versus potentially owning it for a little bit of time, which is a little more sustainable for the environment. But you need to think through the patient perspective. So in this case, it was pelvic floor physical therapy device. What that means is you sit on it without your underwear on in order to get the readings that you need. Just the perception, people didn't want to use one, even though it was fully sanitized, that somebody else had used. They just didn't want to do that, which is pretty understandable. And so then you're looking at purchasing it outright. And so even within, this offering, we had subscription, we had purchasing it outright. Sometimes I see with devices like paying for it over time and then you own it. But lots of different ways to think about accessing the same type of care.
Yeah, absolutely. So purchasing, owning it, lease models, which is what you touched on, razor blade models, right? Can you make the device available for a relatively low cost and then sell the disposables? That becomes an ongoing source of income. If you have a larger device, you can also think about the physical hardware plus service models associated with the physical hardware. And today's day and age, I can't say that there is MedTech without software, right? There is going to be some kind of a software. So can you then have licensing fees associated with the software? And that allows, so think of the business model not just about the company making a lot of money, right? Think about it. How can you structure a business model to get access to your target population faster, but in a way that allows the startup to be sustainable and continue scaling and growing, right? So the multiple business models like device plus service plus licensing, it's not, it might seem like it's a lot, or it might seem like the company is trying to rip you off, but that's not the case. The case is, how do you get to market? How do you keep your device costs relatively low, right? Like, how do you make sure that your device is affordable? Then you can do that by maybe providing a service model that somebody has to use once a year, have some licensing fees, so that you're making sure that the availability is there for the products that need to reach the patient population. We do have a question from Victoria. Victoria says, can you please share your expertise on customer segmentation, such as do you focus on a small segment and create a niche product? Or if that's a targeted course, what are some suggestions on expanding market share after?
Yeah, so I'll take a first pass at this, and then let's definitely open it up. So I feel like this can get really tricky in the way that you laid it out because of regulatory. With regulatory, an easy shortcut way to do it is write your future marketing copy, your future marketing claims, and then you need to prove it through clinical trials and prove that through your regulatory pathway. So if you're writing towards your future patient population or your future clinician population, write all the claims that you want to have and then work backwards. And how are you going to support those claims through your regulatory process? That's a nice shortcut way to make sure that there's no surprises and that you're covered regulatory wise. The FDA can go onto your website and ask you to remove certain things that aren't specifically covered by your regulatory submission that the FDA approved or cleared. So if you're working on a niche product and then going to a larger audience, you definitely want to target the entire large audience in your regulatory submission. But I do see what you're saying here, that you could use different language to target it. So if you're thinking from the user perspective, how are they going, or the person who's the purchaser, how are they going to access your product, and what are those keywords that they're going to use to find your product? How do they speak about your product? How do they perceive your product, and mirror that language in your website? That can be a nice way to really target that niche population and then expand out. Sometimes too, if there's a distinct value proposition for the patient and then also for providers, I've even seen websites, a good way to do it is you have two different pages and they use very different language and speak to the different value propositions of the patient and of the provider. That's a nice way to do it. If you have two different segments, you could do that as well and have like two different pages on your website that speak to the different populations if they're quite distinct. So I would think about like, what's your entire market? Make sure you have that covered so that you can address that entire market. And then, use your language to target how they speak specifically about finding your product so that you can link those two.
Yeah. Yeah, I am a big proponent of identifying your niche, right? What is your beachhead market? You don't want your beachhead market to be small. It has to be a significantly large market for it to justify the business model, right? Because your pitch deck is going to be based on your beachhead market. You may have multiple follow-on markets and you will mention that in your pitch deck, but your pitch deck is going to focus on your beachhead market. So for example, the arrhythmia product that I was talking about, right? When you niche it to patients who are receiving medication and they're using the product for the dosing purposes and monitoring their arrhythmia. Now they can continue the ongoing monitoring, but that is the niche that you've identified, and that has to be large enough. This product now can also use a B2C model where this product is being made directly available to patients who want to take charge of their own health and want to monitor their arrhythmia. It may not be something that the doctor is recommending, because if the doctor is prescribing it, then there has to be a reimbursement code associated with it, right? So for the regulatory purposes, you have to identify your beachhead market and very clearly outline it. From an investor perspective, you have to also outline your beachhead market. And sometimes your first market might be a B2C market if it allows you to get to market faster. With technical products, I always have a little bit of um, caution around B2C markets, because technical products tend to require a lot of buying, because you need to know what you need to know, right? And so, unless a patient is already well informed about their condition and the fact that they need to monitor it, they may not think that this is something that they need to buy. So for MedTech products, my recommendation is always to work with the physician, because they are going to be your champions in getting this product to market. And then once you have developed that credibility through physicians, you can adopt a B2C model. All right, so we are exactly at 1 o'clock, and this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Elyse, for joining us today. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion and for all your insightful questions. If you wish to talk more, both Elyse and I dropped our LinkedIn into the chat. Please feel free to connect with us, to reach out to us, and we would be happy to continue the conversation with you. All right. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and happy weekend.